The neighborhood had always been a peaceful place, the kind of area where people greeted each other in the mornings and waved when they drove past. For years, the homeowner lived there quietly, taking care of his house, minding his own business, and never causing trouble. He liked to say that the best kind of life was a simple one, and he tried to live that way every day. But everything started to change one summer, when a new HOA board took over. It began with a plain, white envelope stuck neatly on his front door. At first, he thought it was some sort of announcement about a community event, maybe a reminder about the yearly barbecue or an update on neighborhood maintenance. Instead, when he opened it, he found a warning letter telling him he had broken several HOA rules. He stood there in his doorway, reading it twice because the whole thing made no sense. The letter said he had placed objects outside that were not allowed. It said he had trimmed his hedges the wrong way. It even claimed he had changed the color of his back gate without permission, even though he had never painted anything not then, not before. The words felt strange, like they were meant for someone else. He looked around his yard, wondering if he had somehow missed something, but everything looked the same as it always had. A few days later, he received another letter, this time with a fine. He stared at the number printed there, unable to believe they were charging him for something he didn't do. He tried to stay calm. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding, he thought. Maybe the new board had mixed up the addresses or confused him with someone else. But when he called the HOA office to ask, the woman on the phone spoke to him like she had already decided he was guilty. She told him the board had inspected his property and found multiple violations. She said photos had been taken. Asked to see the photos, she said they would be presented in a meeting. When he asked when the meeting would be, she gave him a date that was still weeks away. That night, he sat at his kitchen table thinking about everything. It never had trouble with the HOA before. The old board was strict but fair. They talked to people, explained things, and actually listened. The new board, however, seemed to enjoy sending warnings instead of talking. Something about their tone felt heavy-handed, almost like they wanted to show everyone who was in charge. The next morning, he stepped outside to check his yard again. The grass was trimmed neatly. His tools were stored in the shed. The gate was the same color it had always been. Still, the fact that the HOA saw something different made him uneasy. So he took pictures of everything, walking slowly around his property, taking photos from different angles just to be safe. He didn't want to be caught unprepared. A week passed without another letter, but then one showed up this time accusing him of keeping an unauthorized structure. He stared at the description in confusion. They were talking about the small wooden bench he had bought years ago. It wasn't new, and it wasn't even big. It was just a simple bench where he sometimes sat in the evenings to drink tea. He had never thought a single piece of outdoor furniture could get someone in trouble. He decided to go to the HOA office in person. When he walked inside, he found 3 board members sitting behind a long desk. They were new faces, people he had barely seen around the neighborhood. He tried to keep his voice steady as he explained the situation, but they didn't seem impressed. One of them leaned forward and said the bench did not meet community visual standards. Another said he had modified exterior elements without approval. When he asked again to see the photos they claimed to have, they told him they were still being processed. It felt strange. Everything felt too practiced, too rehearsed. It didn't feel like they were helping him solve a problem. It felt like they had already decided the outcome. He walked home frustrated. The whole situation was beginning to wear on him. He wasn't someone who enjoyed conflict, but he also wasn't someone who backed down when he knew he was right. Spent the next few days quietly documenting everything, the state of his yard, the dates of the letters, even the conversations he had with the board. The neighbors noticed the stress on his face. One of them approached him one evening and asked what was going on. When he explained everything, the neighbors shook their head in disbelief. He said the new board had been acting strange lately, sending letters to multiple people, accusing them of things that felt exaggerated or completely untrue. It wasn't just him. Others were experiencing the same sudden pressure. That made him feel a little better, though not by much. At least he knew he wasn't being singled out. But it also meant the entire neighborhood was being pushed around by people who didn't seem to care about fairness. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time threatening further fines if he didn't remove the bench immediately. He read it 3 times, standing on his porch as the afternoon sun warmed the air around him. The creak of a passing bicycle and the hum of distant traffic blended with the rising frustration inside him. He decided to check his city permits. The bench didn't need one, but some things in his yard did. Years ago, he had installed a small garden structure and a shade sail, both approved by the city. He hadn't thought about those permits in a long time, but he dug through an old filing box until he found them. As he looked them over, he felt a strange sense of relief. The city had approved everything. He wasn't breaking any real laws. HOA rules were supposed to help keep the neighborhood looking nice, not contradict the law itself.
Ow.
The letters from the HOA made him feel like he had done something wrong, but the city paperwork told him otherwise. He decided to call the city office to confirm. A polite staff member told him everything was still valid. Nothing had expired. His property was compliant. Hearing that made him breathe easier, but it also raised a new question in his mind. If the city said everything was fine, then why was the HOA so focused on finding problems? That night, he thought a lot about the next HOA meeting. He planned to bring all the documents, photos, and proof with him. He hoped the board would listen this time. He hoped the issue would finally settle down. Maybe they would understand once he showed them the facts. But deep inside, a quiet worry kept whispering that the board didn't want to understand. They wanted control. He didn't want to think that way. But each letter, each accusation, and each dismissal of his questions made it hard not to. Still, he tried to stay hopeful. He had always believed that things could be solved calmly. Maybe this situation just needed a good conversation. However, as the day of the meeting approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. People walked around with a cautious look, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Some neighbors whispered in small groups. Others avoided the board members altogether. No one knew exactly what the HOA was planning next. But everyone could feel the tension rising. On the morning of the meeting, he woke up earlier than usual. He walked around his yard one more time, making sure everything was as it should be. He checked his documents again, neatly organizing them in a folder. Didn't want to leave any room for misunderstanding. When the time finally came, headed toward the community hall, unaware that the situation was about to take a much bigger turn. The board wasn't just being strict. They were preparing for something that would shake the whole neighborhood, and he had no idea that soon. The police would be involved, and the truth would come out in a way no one expected. The days after the meeting notice arrived felt heavier than usual, as if the air in the neighborhood had changed. People still watered their lawns, walked their dogs, and said their usual greetings, but everything seemed quieter. Even the birds sounded softer in the mornings, or maybe he was just too wrapped up in what was happening. Still, he tried not to let the stress take over. He woke up early, cleaned up his yard again, and made sure everything was neat. If the HOA wanted to look for problems, they weren't going to find any. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. It seemed determined, almost eager to find something wrong. 2 days before the scheduled meeting, he saw 2 board members walking slowly along the sidewalk near his yard, pointing at things with small clipboards in their hands. They didn't say anything to him. They didn't even look at him. They just whispered, wrote notes, and walked on like they owned the entire street. He watched them from his porch, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He knew that. But their silence and the way they acted made him feel guilty anyway, as though they had already decided who he was, not a neighbor, but a problem. Later that day, another letter arrived. This one said he had 30 days to correct visual disruptions in the backyard. He read the letter carefully, line by line, trying to understand what they meant. What visual disruption? He walked into the backyard again, looking around. It looked the same as always. A few flowering plants, a small garden patch. It's the same wooden bench that caused so much trouble already. It's nothing strange. He held the letter in his hand as he walked around, reading it again and again. The wording felt intentionally vague, almost like they wanted to keep things unclear so they could say anything was a violation. That night, he sat at the table and wrote everything down in a notebook. Dates, times, what was said, what he saw. He didn't want to forget anything. He didn't trust the HOA to be fair, so he had to make sure he had proof. It felt strange, almost like preparing for something bigger than a simple disagreement. But the more letters they sent, the more serious everything started to feel. The next morning, he decided to ask another neighbor if they had received similar letters. When he walked next door, the neighbor was trimming a small hedge. After a quick greeting, he brought up the HOA issue gently. The neighbor sighed deeply, wiped sweat from his forehead, and nodded. He said the HOA had accused him of storing unapproved equipment near his garage. The so-called unapproved item turned out to be a garden hose. A regular, harmless garden hose. He told him how frustrated he felt, how the new board seemed to be making up rules as they went along. Hearing that made the homeowner feel both relieved and unsettled. Relieved because he wasn't the only one being targeted. Unsettled because it meant the HOA was spreading this behavior across the whole community. As the meeting day approached, the HOA began sending out reminders to the entire neighborhood. They posted signs on community boards. They sent emails. They even sent text alerts through the neighborhood app. The way they talked about the meeting made it seem dramatic, like a courtroom event rather than a simple gathering. On the morning of the meeting, he gathered his documents, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The sky was clear, and the air felt warm. He hoped it was a sign that things might go smoothly. Still, his stomach felt heavy. When he arrived at the community hall, several neighbors were already there, quietly talking among themselves. Some nodded to him with sympathetic expressions. A few gave small smiles, the kind that tried to reassure him. The hall was simple, with folding chairs set up in straight lines and a long table at the front where the board members sat. The board members looked serious when he walked in. They didn't greet anyone. They didn't say anything. They just sat there with their notebooks and their printed rule books. When the room filled up, one of them stood and began talking about community standards, rule enforcement, and maintaining uniformity. It was all very formal. Too formal. There was no warmth or friendliness, just strict words and cold expressions. The board members spoke as if they were running a courtroom instead of a neighborhood. After several minutes of long explanations, they finally got to the part involving him. They called him to the front. He stood there calmly with his folder in hand. They listed every violation he had supposedly made, reading them out loud as if presenting evidence in a trial. When they finished, he spoke in a calm voice. He explained how each accusation was untrue. He showed photos of his yard. He showed the documents from the city, proving that everything on his property was fully permitted. He tried to stay respectful, even though the tension in the room made his heart beat faster. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, surprised by the evidence he presented. Others seemed confused about why the HOA was making such a big deal out of simple issues, but the board did not seem moved. One board member glanced at the documents and then slid them aside like they were unimportant. Another shook their head and said, "The HOA rules carry more weight in community matters than city paperwork." That sentence made the entire room fall silent for a moment. He looked at them, stunned. He had expected resistance, but not something like that. HOA rules couldn't just replace actual law. That wasn't how things worked. He calmly explained that he had followed every law required by the city, that the city itself had confirmed everything was approved. But the board dismissed him again, repeating that the HOA had its own system. A neighbor raised their hand and asked a simple question. How can HOA rules be above the city? But the board didn't give a real answer. They just said they expected all community members to follow their decisions without question. That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted. People started whispering louder this time. Some shook their heads. A few even stood up in disbelief. The board members noticed the change and seemed frustrated by the reaction. And then, things got even stranger. One of the board members stood up and claimed they had the right to inspect any yard at any time. They said homeowners didn't need to be present. They said the HOA had authority to enter backyards if they believed there was a violation. A quiet murmur spread across the room. It wasn't anger at first, more like shock. No one had ever heard that rule before. It wasn't written in the official documents. It wasn't mentioned in any of the old HOA guidelines. He stepped forward again and spoke carefully. He said he respected the HOA's role, but the idea of entering private property without permission wasn't just unreasonable, it was illegal. He stayed calm, but his voice carried enough strength that everyone heard him clearly. The board didn't like that. One of them scowled and accused him of challenging authority. They said he was refusing to cooperate and ignoring their inspections. He took a slow breath and said he wasn't refusing anything. He just wanted fairness and clarity. He wanted the rules to be real rules, not things made up on the spot. But the board didn't listen. Instead, one of them pulled out a final document stating that if he didn't remove the unauthorized items from his property within 7 days, he would face heavier penalties. When he pointed out again that the items were approved by the city, the board waved their hands dismissively. The tension in the room was rising. Everyone could feel it. Then a moment came that no one was expecting. A board member turned sharply and told another member to call the police. They claimed the homeowner was refusing HOA, its compliance and causing disturbances. The room fell silent. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances. Even the board members looked uncertain for a brief moment, but no one stepped in to stop it. He stood there, calm on the outside. Though inside, he felt a strange mix of disbelief and frustration. He had come to the meeting with proof, with evidence, with patience. And now, the board wanted to involve the police over something that made no sense. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. He simply stepped back and waited. The board member made the call. Minutes felt long as everyone waited. Some neighbors whispered that things had gone too far. Others said they had never seen anything like this. The board sat stiffly, their faces tight, as if preparing for some kind of victory. When the police car finally pulled up outside the hall, everyone's attention went to the doorway. 2 officers stepped inside, looking around with calm but alert expressions. The board members quickly pointed toward him, trying to explain their version. The officers listened for a moment, then turned to him and asked what was going on. He explained everything clearly, handed them the documents from the city, and showed them the letters the HOA had sent. He didn't exaggerate anything. He didn't accuse anyone. He simply told the truth. The officers listened carefully. After a moment, one of them stepped aside and made a call. The room grew quiet again, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. And that was the moment the situation began to shift in a direction no one in that room expected. The officer on the phone wasn't calling the HOA, he was calling the police chief, and the police chief was already on his way. What happened next would not only change the situation for him but for the entire neighborhood. The moment the officer mentioned that the police chief was coming, the room changed in a way that could almost be felt in the air. Conversations stopped. People sat straighter. Even the board members, who had been so confident just minutes ago, exchanged uneasy glances. No one expected things to escalate like this, not over a bench, a garden, whatever else the HOA thought they had found. He stood there quietly, folding his hands in front of him. He wasn't nervous, just tired. Tired of the constant accusations, the unfair treatment, and the strange determination the board had to prove he was somehow breaking the law. He had done everything right. He had checked, double-checked, and gathered proof. Yet here he was, waiting for the police chief because the HOA refused to accept facts. The officers didn't say much as they waited. They stayed calm, watching the room, making sure everything remained peaceful. A few neighbors approached him softly, asking if he was okay. He nodded, grateful for their concern. Some whispered that the board had gone too far and that they were glad someone was finally standing up to them. But he didn't feel like a hero. He had only wanted fairness, nothing more. After a few minutes, a police SUV pulled up outside. The glass doors opened, and the police chief stepped inside. He had a steady walk, the kind of presence that made people sit a little straighter without him saying a word. He looked around the room, taking in the tension, the crowded chairs, the board members behind their table, and finally, the homeowner standing calmly off to the side. The chief greeted the officers first, then turned to the board. He asked in a clear, even tone what the issue was. One of the board members quickly stepped forward and started explaining, using long sentences and big words as if trying to make the matter sound more serious than it really was. They spoke about violations, community standards, rule enforcement, and refusal to comply. Their voices carried a mix of authority and desperation. The chief listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change. He simply nodded every few seconds, letting them finish their explanation. When they were finally done, he turned to the homeowner and asked him to explain his side. He handed the chief his folder, the city permits, the photos, the letters, all neatly organized. The chief took his time going through each page, reading carefully. The room stayed silent. Even the neighbors held their breath, waiting to see what he would say. After a moment, the chief looked up. He asked the homeowner a few simple questions. He got the permits, whether anything had changed since then, and if the HOA had ever spoken to him directly before issuing the letters. His answers were honest and straightforward. Then the chief turned back to the board. He asked them if they had verified the violations with the city. Their silence said everything. They looked at each other, uncomfortable. The chief repeated the question, slower this time. Again, no one answered finally. One board member muttered something about internal authority and community-specific regulations. The chief's eyebrows rose slightly at that. He took a step forward, placed the folder on the table in front of them, and spoke clearly so everyone could hear. City permits are legal documents, he said. They stand above any neighborhood rule. HOA guidelines cannot override city, county, state, or federal law. That is not how it works. The room stayed quiet, except for a few soft gasps. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One tried to argue, saying the HOA had the right to enforce uniformity. Another said they were only trying to keep the neighborhood clean. The chief listened, but he shook his head. He said, uniformity doesn't mean making up violations. And it doesn't mean calling the police on a homeowner who hasn't broken any laws. Several neighbors nodded. Some even murmured their agreement. The board members seemed to shrink back slightly in their chairs. The chief went on to explain that calling the police without proper cause was a misuse of emergency services. False reports were not something to be taken lightly. The officers beside him didn't say anything, but their expressions showed they agreed. One board member tried to recover by insisting the homeowner had refused an inspection. The chief asked what kind of inspection they meant. When the board explained that they wanted access to backyards without prior notice, he leaned back slightly and stared at them in disbelief. Without permission? He asked. They nodded. The chief turned his head slowly, making sure the entire room was listening before saying, "You cannot enter private property without consent. Not even the police can do that without legal authority. Certainly not an HOA." A soft wave of whispers spread across the room again. People finally realized how serious the board's actions had been. The chief then turned to the homeowner and told him he had every right to refuse unauthorized entry. He assured him he had done nothing wrong and that the documents from the city were valid and legally binding. The board members looked pale. Some avoided eye contact. Others shuffled papers in front of them, as if hoping they could hide behind the clutter. The chief wasn't finished. He warned the board that continued harassment of homeowners based on false claims could lead to formal complaints and legal consequences. He said HOAs were meant to support communities, not bully them. A few neighbors clapped quietly, though most stayed silent out of shock. The chief then turned back to the officers and told them there was no crime, no violation, and no reason for further action. The officers nodded and stepped back. The tension in the room finally loosened, but the board seemed unsure what to do next. One of them tried to regain control by saying the meeting must continue, but most people didn't want to listen to them anymore. Conversations began breaking out among the neighbors, louder now, more confident. The homeowner walked outside for a moment, needing fresh air. The sun had dipped lower, casting warm orange light across the street. He exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his chest. He didn't like confrontation, but he felt grateful the truth had finally been spoken by someone with real authority. He looked around and saw neighbors gathering in small groups, talking about what just happened. Some approached him, shaken but relieved, saying they were proud of how calmly he handled everything. He thanked them quietly, still processing the events. After a few minutes, the chief stepped outside too. He walked over with the same calm expression he had earlier. "I just want you to know," the chief said in a steady voice. "You handle this well. Not everyone stays this patient under pressure." He nodded and thanked him. The chief explained that he would file a record of the incident and note the misuse of police resources. He said that if the HOA continued making false reports, further action could be taken. Before leaving, the chief added one more thing. No one is above the law. It's not even an HOA with a list of rules. The statement stayed with him long after the chief walked back to his vehicle. When he returned to the community hall, many neighbors were already gathering their things. A few board members were still seated, looking defeated and unsure. The rest had left quietly, slipping out through the side door as people headed home. Several neighbors stopped to thank him for standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had felt pressured by the HOA but had been too afraid to speak up. He didn't feel like he had done anything special. He had simply told the truth. But the relief in their voices made him realize how deeply the board's behavior had affected the whole community. That night, he sat at home and reviewed the events in his mind. The meeting, the accusations, the police arriving, chief speaking the truth everyone needed to hear. Felt surreal, like something that should not have happened in a quiet neighborhood. But what mattered most was that the truth was finally out in the open. Still, he had no idea that the real consequences for the HOA were only beginning. The investigation that would follow would expose even more than anyone expected. The day after the police chief spoke at the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. It was as if a heavy curtain had been lifted and everyone could finally breathe again. People stood outside their homes more than usual, talking in small groups, sharing what they saw and heard. Some looked relieved, others still stunned. The HOA board had always acted strict, but no one imagined things would reach a point where the police chief had to step in. The homeowner woke up early the next morning feeling lighter. Though not completely relaxed, the situation wasn't over. Not yet. Even though the chief had made things clear, he knew the HOA wouldn't simply back down without trying something else. They had shown how far they were willing to go, and he didn't trust them to suddenly change. Still, he took comfort in knowing the truth was now out in the open. People had seen the board's behavior, heard their claims, and watched the chief dismantle their arguments with simple facts. No one could pretend they didn't know what was going on anymore. He stepped outside, and a few neighbors waved him over. They thanked him again for staying calm during the meeting. One neighbor admitted they had been afraid of speaking up before, thinking the HOA might target them next. Another said they were tired of living under constant pressure from rules that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Before long, more neighbors joined the conversation. Some shared their own stories, warnings about unapproved flower pots, threats of fines for improperly placed trash bins, and even accusations about lawn colors being too light or too dark. Hearing these stories confirmed something he had suspected for weeks. The board had been treating many people unfairly, but most had stayed silent out of fear. Later that afternoon, he received a short email from the HOA. It didn't mention the police chief's statements or their mistakes at the meeting. Instead, it said they would review recent events and discuss adjustments to certain enforcement procedures. The wording felt careful, almost rehearsed, as if they were trying to protect themselves. He read the message twice. It wasn't an apology, not even close. It was the kind of message that tried to sound official while saying nothing meaningful. He closed his laptop with a sigh. Didn't expect a real apology. A small part of him hoped for at least some acknowledgement. As the week went on, the HOA seemed quieter. They didn't send new letters or warnings, and the board members kept to themselves. But their silence didn't make anyone feel safer. If anything, the neighborhood felt like it was waiting for something to happen. One evening, just as the sun was starting to set, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found one of the officers who had come to the meeting. The officer smiled politely and said he was just following up. He wanted to make sure there had been no more issues and that the homeowner felt safe. They talked for a few minutes by the doorstep. The officer explained that the police chief had filed the situation in their internal records. That meant if the HOA tried calling the police again with false accusations, the department would already know the history. There would be consequences for wasting resources. The homeowner felt a wave of relief. The officer's words made him feel protected in a way he hadn't felt for weeks. After closing the door, he sat on his couch for a while, letting everything sink in. He appreciated how calmly the police had handled the situation. They hadn't taken sides, They had simply followed the law, and in doing so, they had shown everyone the difference between real authority and imagined authority. A few days later, another neighbor knocked on his door. This neighbor was older and had lived in the community much longer. He came holding a folder of his own. When the homeowner invited him inside, the older man explained that he had received several warnings from the HOA as well, but he had kept them hidden out of embarrassment. When he opened the folder, the homeowner saw letters about tiny, harmless things, a small crack in a walkway, a slightly raised stone, even a claim that his mailbox was at the wrong height. The neighbor said he had paid fines because he didn't want arguments. Hearing that broke the homeowner's heart a little. The older man looked tired, almost ashamed, as if he had done something wrong when he clearly hadn't. That night, the homeowner made a decision. He realized the HOA's actions weren't just about him. Their behavior had been hurting multiple families, even those who stayed silent. If no one took action now, others would continue to suffer. The next morning, he called the city office and asked what the formal complaint process was for HOA misconduct. The city staff explained everything, which forms to fill, what documents to include, and how investigations usually unfolded. He spent most of the day gathering all the letters, photos, emails, and even notes from the meeting. He wanted to make sure every detail was clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about bringing fairness back to the neighborhood by midday. He submitted the complaint. Once the complaint was filed, word spread quickly. Neighbors started knocking on his door again, asking how they could file their own complaints. Many had been quiet for too long and were now ready to stand up. He helped them gather their documents, explained what the city had told him, guided them through the process. Within a week, more than a dozen complaints had been submitted. The city office noticed. They contacted the HOA and informed them that an investigation was being opened. The HOA board reacted exactly how he expected. They acted shocked, defensive, and offended. They sent out a long community email claiming they were victims of misunderstanding and unfair accusations. But the neighbors weren't fooled anymore. People talked openly now. They weren't scared. They weren't silent. They were tired of being pushed around. The investigation began quietly, but thoroughly. City officials visited the neighborhood, reviewed documents, and interviewed homeowners. They asked questions about the board's decisions, the sudden rule changes, the way violations had been handled. Some board members avoided the inspectors entirely. Others tried to justify their actions. But their answers didn't match the evidence. One afternoon, a city inspector visited the homeowner's property. He walked around the yard, checked the structures, and reviewed the permits. After finishing, he smiled and said everything was perfectly fine. Nothing came close to violating city rules. Hearing that again felt like a breath of fresh air as the investigation continued. More details surfaced. The city discovered that the HOA had been enforcing rules that weren't official, rules that had never been approved, and rules that contradicted city guidelines. They had issued fines without proper documentation and threatened liens they had no authority to place. It was worse than anyone expected. The city called for a community meeting to discuss their findings. When the day came, the hall was packed. Almost the entire neighborhood showed up. The board sat together at the front, stiff and silent. A city official spoke clearly, explaining the violations the HOA itself had committed. He stated that multiple actions taken by the board were improper, unapproved, or completely unlawful. People murmured in disbelief. The official then announced that the board would be required to step down. A temporary administrator would manage the HOA until new board elections could take place. The room erupted into relieved applause. Some board members hung their heads. Others looked furious. But they couldn't argue. The evidence was stacked against them, and everyone in the room had seen it. After the meeting, neighbors gathered outside again, this time smiling, laughing softly, and thanking each other. They felt free for the first time in months. The homeowner stood quietly among them, listening to their gratitude. He didn't feel like a leader or a hero. He felt like someone who had simply done what needed to be done. Someone who stood up not only for himself, but for the entire community. Later that evening, as the sun set and the neighborhood settled into a peaceful quiet, he stepped into his backyard and sat on the same wooden bench that had caused so much trouble. The bench looked simple, calm, and perfectly harmless, just like it always had been. He closed his eyes for a moment, grateful that the truth had finally come to light, but the story wasn't finished yet. The biggest moment, the one that would leave the neighborhood changed forever, was still waiting just around the corner. The next morning began quietly, but there was a different feeling in the air. The man woke up early, not because he was worried, but because he finally felt some peace. The storm of the previous days had been exhausting, yet it had also brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone in authority had actually listened to him. The words from the police chief stayed with him. They made him feel seen, understood, and finally protected. Still, he knew the situation wasn't over. The HOA would not simply walk away from the mess they created. Before the sun even rose fully, he walked outside with a cup of tea in hand. The air was cold, and the street was quiet. Birds hopped along the fences, and neighbors' curtains were still closed. Nothing looked different, but he knew things had already changed. The board members had been embarrassed in front of many people. The police chief had spoken clearly, and the HOA would need to think carefully before trying anything again. A little while later, his neighbor from across the street approached him slowly. She looked unsure if she should speak. He greeted her with a friendly smile, and that seemed to ease her nerves. She stood there quietly for a moment before she finally spoke. She told him she had witnessed everything. She saw how the HOA behaved, how they twisted the rules, and how they tried to act as if they held more power than the city itself. She said she wanted to support him in whatever came next, because she was tired of being scared of the board. He thanked her sincerely. Hearing that meant a lot. It reminded him that many neighbors felt trapped by the HOA, but were afraid to speak out. They feared fines, threats, or more drama. But now, after everything that happened, they were finally willing to stand up. Later that day, he took the paperwork he had prepared. This included all the warning letters, the pictures he had taken, the videos of their surprise inspections, and the city's official documents. Everything was neatly arranged in a folder. He drove to the city offices, feeling calm but determined. When he reached the counter, he explained the full situation. The staff listened carefully. They did not treat it like a small complaint. Instead, they took notes, asked questions, and even recognized the names of certain HOA members from past incidents. They gave him the forms needed to file a formal complaint. They also told him that once the city started investigating, the HOA would be required to cooperate fully. This gave him even more confidence. He wasn't trying to punish them out of anger. He just wanted fairness. He wanted the intimidation to stop not only for him, but for everyone in the neighborhood. When he got home, a few more neighbors approached him. They were quiet at first, unsure of how much to say. But once they realized he was open to talking, they began sharing their own stories. Some had been fined unfairly. Some were told to change things on their property that were completely legal. Others had been too afraid to speak against the board. They all had something in common. They felt powerless against the HOA. The man listened carefully to each person. He didn't rush them. He didn't judge. He simply offered them calm advice and encouraged them to come forward if they felt safe doing so. Slowly, they began to realize that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as powerless as they thought. That evening, he sat outside on his porch again. The day had been long, but he felt productive. The sky turned orange as the sun set behind the houses. Just when he thought things were winding down, a car pulled up in front of his home. It was the police chief. The chief stepped out and walked toward him with a calm, friendly expression. The man offered him a seat, and they sat together quietly for a moment. The chief said he wasn't there for official reasons. He just wanted to check on him after the stress of the previous day. That simple gesture meant more than the man expected. The chief told him that the law was always clear: no private group, including an HOA, could override city authority. He reminded him that if anything else happened, the police department would handle it without hesitation. The man nodded, grateful. They talked for a while about the neighborhood, about fairness, and about how power can sometimes make people forget basic decency. It wasn't an intense conversation. It felt more like two people sharing quiet thoughts after a long and complicated week. After the chief left, the man felt something shift inside him. All the stress, fear, and frustration that had built up inside him began to fade. For a long time, he had felt alone, facing a powerful group that treated him unfairly. Now he didn't feel alone at all. He realized that what happened wasn't just about him and the HOA. It was about everyone in the community. Days passed, and slowly the investigation moved forward. The HOA was informed that they had to cooperate with city officials. They weren't pleased. They avoided eye contact with neighbors. Their confident tone disappeared. Some even resigned quietly before the investigation reached them. A few weeks later, the city's final report came out. It stated that the HOA had overstepped their authority multiple times. They had issued fines without proper cause, conducted unauthorized inspections, and made false claims. The report also mentioned that their attempt to ignore city permits was a serious violation. Because of this, the board was required to step down. A new election took place. This time, the neighbors worked together. They chose people who listened, people who cared about fairness, and most importantly, people who understood that an HOA was meant to support the community, not control it. When the new board took over, the whole mood of the neighborhood changed. People greeted each other more. Children played outside without parents worrying about someone complaining over small things. The air felt lighter. One afternoon, the man walked through the neighborhood, and many people waved at him. Some thanked him quietly. Some smiled warmly. One elderly neighbor even told him he reminded her of someone who brings calm after a storm. This made him laugh gently. He didn't feel like a hero, but he was glad things were peaceful again. At home, he sat on his porch once more, enjoying the cool breeze. He looked at his backyard, the same backyard the HOA had complained about for no reason. It looked peaceful, untouched, and exactly the way he liked it. Life had returned to normal, but something inside him had changed forever. He understood now that when someone stands up for what is right, even in a simple and quiet way, it can help many others. He learned that fairness might take time, but it always arrives eventually. The neighborhood was calm again. The threats were gone. The fear was gone, and the people felt like a community once more. He leaned back, took a deep breath, and felt grateful that in the end, truth had spoken louder than any rule in the law had spoken louder than the ones who tried to twist it.